There's a moment, and I can't tell you exactly when it happens because it sneaks up on you the way a cold front does, quiet and inevitable, where you realize you've been looking at someone without ever actually seeing them. I've been turning that over in my head for 14 months now. 14 months since the exam. 14 months since everything I thought I understood about strength, about survival, about what it actually means to be capable. All of it got rearranged in a single afternoon on a planet that shouldn't have been able to sustain anything alive, let alone a third-year cadet from a gravity, well, most of the galaxy had never heard of. His name was Elliot Marsh. And I'm going to tell you about him the way I actually experienced it, not the cleaned-up version they put in the Academy's commemorative bulletin, not the version where everyone looks good and the language is careful and diplomatic. The real version. The one where I'm sitting in the exam observation bay with 32 other cadets, and I'm watching a human boy walk into a Deathworld screening chamber like he's going to the mess hall to get a cup of something warm. And I'm feeling genuinely sorry for him because I think we're about to watch something sad happen. I want you to understand that feeling because I think it matters, the pity I felt, the embarrassment I felt for him almost, before I understood what he actually was. Chapter 1. The Academy of 1,000 Worlds. The Interstellar Academy of Unified Sciences sits at the gravitational midpoint between the Ketharan cluster and the outer arm of what humans call the Milky Way. Though most species in the Academy had a different name for it, something that roughly translated to the long road of ancient light, which I always thought was nicer than Milky Way, personally, but that's beside the point. The Academy is enormous. I mean that in a way that's hard to put into words even now, even after 3 years of walking its corridors and eating in its communal bays and sleeping in pressurized dormitories calibrated to 11 different atmospheric compositions. It is not just a building. It is not just a campus. It is a structure the size of a small moon that has been carved, constructed, and continuously expanded across 400 years of cooperative interstellar effort. And it contains within it approximately 14,000 students from 63 different species, representing 112 worlds. I am Usald Marin. My home planet is Aviath Sul, which is a temperate world in the Ketharan cluster, notable mostly for its unusually dense atmospheric pressure, and the fact that we have 4 distinct tidal cycles because of our 3 moons. My species, the Avethian, looked to most other Academy students roughly like a tall, blue-gray humanoid with the bone density of something that evolved under significant gravitational stress. We have secondary eyelids. We have a second set of smaller fingers behind the primary ones. Our hearing range extends significantly beyond most carbon-based species' upper threshold. I say all of this not to be pedantic, but because it's relevant. Because one of the things the Academy teaches you, or tries to teach you, is that every species' biology is a record of the environment that produced it. You look at a Keth, and you see a creature built for low light and cold. You look at a Drovian, and you see something engineered by hundreds of thousands of years in near-zero gravity. You look at a Shreth, and you understand immediately that their homeworld had something very fast trying to eat them, once upon a time. And then you look at a human. And you see what exactly? That was always the question, wasn't it? I had met 3 humans before Elliot. One was a second year in the Xenolinguistics program who wore thick-rimmed optical aids and spoke in a rapid, tumbling way that made her hard to follow. One was a senior cadet in the engineering track who was pleasant and quiet and very good at spatial reasoning. The third was an instructor's assistant in the biology rotation who made jokes that landed roughly 40% of the time and was trying, visibly and sincerely, to do a good job. All 3 of them were, by every available metric, fine, normal, competent in their areas, a little strange in the ways all humans were a little strange. The nervous energy, the excessive expressiveness, the tendency to personalize inanimate objects, but nothing remarkable. Nothing that made you think, This species is something to watch. Earth had only been in formal contact with the Galactic Assembly for 61 years. In Academy terms, that made humanity an infant civilization. They had sent a handful of cadets each cycle since first contact, and by most accounts those cadets had been adequate students. Not exceptional, not failing, adequate. So when Elliot Marsh arrived at the start of the second year of my enrollment, he blended in the way all humans blended in, by being unremarkable enough that your eyes slid off him and kept moving. He was enrolled in the general sciences track, same as me. He was of average height for a human male, which made him shorter than most species at the academy and taller than a few. He had dark hair that he kept short but not styled. He had brown eyes. He wore the same gray cadet uniform as everyone else, and he kept it cleaner and neater than most, but not in a way that suggested vanity, more like habit. He sat in the third row of our unified physics lectures. He sat in the middle of our xenobiology seminars. He sat slightly to the left of center in our comparative civilizations discussions, and he took notes by hand on actual physical paper, which was unusual enough that I noticed it the first week, and then stopped noticing it because I filed it under human quirk and moved on. He was quiet. That was the word everyone used for him. I found out later when I started asking around. Quiet. Not shy exactly, he'd answer questions when called on, and the answers were always correct, always clearly thought through. Not antisocial, he'd eat in the communal bay with whoever was nearby, and he'd contribute to conversations when he had something to add. But he never pushed. He never made himself the center of anything. He never volunteered opinions on things that hadn't been specifically solicited. I asked Cadet Thren, a Drovian in my study cohort with a gift for social observation, what he thought of Elliot after the first month of second year, and Thren tilted his head the way Drovians do when they're genuinely considering something and said, "He seems tired." "Tired?" I said. "Not sleepy, just tired." Like someone who has already made all the arguments and is waiting to see if reality catches up. I thought about that a lot later. I think Thren was seeing something real, but at the time, I just nodded and went back to my study notes and mostly forgot about Elliot Marsh until he became impossible to forget. Chapter 2: What the exam actually is. I need to explain the Deathworld screening exam because most people outside the academy don't understand what it actually involves, and the popular accounts tend to focus on the dramatic parts without giving you enough context to understand why they're dramatic. Every general sciences cadet at the academy takes the Deathworld screening exam in their second or third year. It is, officially, a multi-environment endurance and adaptation assessment. It is, unofficially, the exam where they figure out who can handle genuinely dangerous field conditions and who needs to be rooted to a specialty that keeps them in controlled laboratory settings. Deathworld is a colloquial term in galactic taxonomy for any planet that falls above a certain threshold on the Environmental Hostility Index, a composite score that accounts for atmospheric toxicity, temperature variation ranges, gravitational deviation from standard, radiation levels, tectonic instability, biological threat density, and a few other factors. Most inhabited worlds in the assembly fall well below the threshold. Earth, interestingly, falls slightly above it, a fact that caused some administrative confusion when humanity first applied for assembly membership, and that most humans seem to find either amusing or quietly satisfying. The exam takes place on Kareth 7, which is a death world in the way a meat grinder is a kitchen tool, technically accurate but missing something essential about the scale of the problem. Kareth 7 has 0.87 standard gravity, an atmosphere with elevated sulfur compounds and marginally sufficient oxygen, ambient temperatures that swing between -30 and +60 over the course of a single-day cycle, frequent ionic storm activity, and a surface ecology that has evolved under the assumption that everything else on the planet is something to eat. Cadets are sent to Kareth 7 in small cohorts, never more than 8 per group, equipped with standard field gear and a locator beacon. The exam runs for 6 standard hours. The objectives are: reach the designated extraction point, keep your cohort alive and intact, and document what you encounter using your field recording equipment. There is no combat component to the exam, officially. The Academy's position is that cadets are not expected to fight anything. The Academy's actual statistical record shows that roughly 40% of exam cohorts encounter at least one significant hostile biological event and have to make decisions about it. The exam is calibrated differently for different species. Drovians, who are physically robust but have difficulty with certain atmospheric compositions, get a slightly modified oxygen supply configuration. Keth cadets get darkened visor filters because their light sensitivity puts them at a disadvantage in the surface radiation environment. Adjustments are made. It's supposed to be a level assessment, calibrated to test each species against its own capacities rather than against an absolute standard. Human cadets get standard gear. That had always been the protocol since the first human sat the exam, 17 years before Elliot, and as far as anyone in the Academy administration seemed to be aware, standard gear was fine for humans. Earth was technically a death world, yes, but the humans who came through the Academy were civil, educated, soft-spoken people who worked in labs and libraries. They needed standard gear the same way anyone needed standard gear, as a baseline. Nobody had thought to ask what standard gear does, and does not mean for a species that casually lives on a planet that can kill most of the Assembly's member species in under 4 minutes of unprotected exposure. Nobody had thought to ask because nobody had thought about it. Because the humans they'd been seeing in the Academy for 17 years had been, and I say this with genuine retrospective guilt, performing a kind of social camouflage. Being whatever was minimally disruptive. Turning the volume down. Staying in the middle rows, taking notes on paper, answering when called on and not pushing. Elliot Marsh was about to stop performing. Chapter 3, the morning before. The exam cohorts are assigned randomly, with species composition weighted slightly to ensure each group has at least some physical diversity. Elliot's cohort, for the 3rd-year cycle that I was assigned to observe as part of my Observer Corps rotation, consisted of Elliot Marsh, Human Earth; Cadet Sivani, Keth Darkalo 3; Cadets Ur and Pur, a Drovian bonded pair from Verath Station; Cadet Thessaly Vorn, Avethian, same world as me, 2 years ahead; Cadet Gretmaka, Shreth, homeworld unrecorded in my notes; Cadet Liss, a small luminescent species called Ilvin whose homeworld I couldn't find in 3 minutes of searching and still can't recall precisely. I am telling you their names because they all became important. Not heroes, just people who happened to be in the right place to understand something that the rest of us, watching remotely from the observation bay, almost missed entirely. I watched them assemble in the staging area at 600 hours. The observation bay where I sat with the other observer cadets had a full-wall display connected to the exam environment's drone network. 12 aerial drones and 4 ground-level units that gave us a rotating mosaic of the cohort's location, the surrounding terrain, and a biometric dashboard for each participant. The biometric dashboard showed heart rate, oxygenation, core temperature, and stress hormone levels. Standard monitors. I watched those monitors for Elliot when they were in the staging area. His heart rate was 56 beats per minute. Resting, essentially. Slow. The Shreth cadet Gretmaka had an elevated heart rate consistent with pre-exam stress. Liss had the kind of irregular biorhythm typical of Ilvin. Sivani was breathing in the short, controlled bursts Keth use when they're anxious. Everyone showed some form of pre-exam stress response. Elliot's heart rate was 56. His face on the drone feed was placid. Not serene exactly, There was something around his eyes that wasn't relaxed exactly, more like focused. The way a person looks when they're listening for something. I made a note of it in my observer log. I wrote, "Human cadet appears calm, possible dissociation or display suppression." I thought maybe he was scared and was good at hiding it. I know now that was wrong in both directions. He wasn't hiding anything and he wasn't scared. He was reading the environment. They entered the staging lock at 6:12. Kareth 7 received them at 6:13. Chapter 4, The First Hour. The extraction point on the exam configuration for that cycle was designated at coordinates 7 kilometers from the insertion point, through a mixed terrain of rocky highland, low scrubland, and a section of what the environment briefing called shallow thermal basin, which was academy language for a flat stretch of ground where geothermal activity made the surface temperature unpredictable and occasionally explosive. I watched from the observation bay. My fellow observer cadets, there were 11 of us, sat in a row in front of the display wall, each with a personal monitoring panel for the cohort members we'd been assigned to track individually. I'd been assigned to track Cadet Thessaly Vorn, the Avethian, because the Observer Corps protocols tried to pair observers with cohort members of their own species for baseline biometric familiarity. But I kept watching Elliot. I couldn't help it. There was something in the way he moved. The cohort came out of the staging lock onto a flat shelf of dark rock, the Kareth 7 sky above them, a bruised yellow-orange from sulfur particulate in the atmosphere. The ground was warm, not dangerously so, but warm in a way you could feel even through insulated boots. The wind was low but present, carrying a smell that the biometric systems registered as high sulfur, medium chain particulate, trace organic decomposition. Every species in the cohort reacted to the atmosphere the way their biology dictated. Savani pulled his filter mask tighter, and his secondary lids closed halfway. Keth light sensitivity, responding to the yellow-orange glare. Gretmaka's Shreth mane flattened, a threat suppression display. I learned later that Shreth do involuntarily in new environments. Ur and Purr pressed briefly together in the Drovian physical anchor reflex before separating. Lys's luminescence dimmed, which is apparently what Ilven do when they're conserving energy for sensory processing. Elliot stood still for approximately 3 seconds, turning his head slowly in an arc from left to right. I watched his heart rate on my secondary monitor. 59 beats per minute. He was doing something with his breathing. I noticed it because it was different from his staging area breathing, slower, deeper, very deliberate. Long inhale, pause, measured exhale. It was rhythmic enough that it looked intentional. Later in my after-action report, I described this as possible stress management technique. I was not wrong, but I was not right either. It was not stress management. It was, and this is my understanding now, built from hours of subsequent conversation with Elliot and with the human physiology researchers who got involved after the exam. It was calibration. He was sampling the air. Not chemically, not through any instrument, but through his own olfactory processing, his own systems, building an internal model of the environment from the sensory data his body was collecting. Humans, it turns out, are much better at this than anyone in the galactic community had bothered to document. They evolved on a Deathworld. Their nervous systems are tuned to process threat information from partially degraded sensory inputs. They can build functional environmental threat maps from smell and wind direction, and the sound of distant geological activity, and the behavior of local fauna. And they do it automatically, below conscious processing level, the way some species navigate using magnetic field sensing. I didn't know any of this at the time. I just saw Elliot stand still for 3 seconds and then turn to the group and say, quietly, "There's something moving in the low scrub about 200 meters northeast. Wind's coming from that direction, so it smells us already. We should probably go southwest first." There was a pause. Gretmaka the Shreth said, "How did you, and then stopped, because Shreth cadets are trained to process new information before challenging it. Thessaly Vorn, my fellow Avethian, looked northeast with her secondary lids open, which is how we extend our visual processing range, and after a moment said, "I don't see anything." "You might not," Elliot said, not dismissive, just honest. "It's low to the ground. The way the scrub is moving doesn't match the wind." Another pause. He was right. The drone feed showed it 20 seconds later when the ground-level unit swept northeast, a Kareth 7 surface predator called a spined crawler, roughly 2 meters long, motionless in the brush, watching the cohort insertion point. It had been there when they landed. It had been still enough to be invisible against the rock and scrub coloring. Elliot had identified it by the way it displaced air. In the observation bay, I heard Cadet Thren, who had been assigned to an adjacent observation station, make a low sound. Not quite a word, just a sound that meant, "Oh." Chapter 5, The Thermal Basin. The cohort moved southwest for 40 minutes through Rocky Highland, and they made good time. I watched on the drone feed. Elliot walked slightly ahead of the group, not leading exactly, more like the way a person walks when they're listening and need to be where the information is clearest. Thessaly and Gretmaka flanked him on the left and right. Ur and Pur followed together. Savani and Liss came last, Savani keeping his eyes down against the yellow-orange light, and Liss moving in the slightly erratic pattern that Ilven use when their sensory processing is running hot. The biometric dashboard showed everyone doing okay. Stress elevated but manageable, core temperatures within range, oxygenation normal with the filter masks. Then they reached the thermal basin. The basin was, as advertised, a flat stretch of ground, roughly 300 meters wide at its narrowest point, between two ridges. The fastest route to the extraction point ran straight across it. The alternative route around it added approximately 3 kilometers, which was significant given the remaining time. The ground surface was pale gray, crusted, with fine cracks running through it in irregular patterns. Steam vented from some of those cracks. The air above the surface shimmered with radiant heat. The drone temperature sensors registered the surface itself at between 60 and 80 degrees, standard hot enough to be extremely unpleasant and potentially dangerous for sustained contact, but not immediately lethal. The crack patterns were the problem. Some of them were hairline fractures over geothermal voids, pockets where the surface was thin and the subsurface temperature was much, much higher. Step on one of those wrong, crack through, and you had a very different situation. The standard exam protocol for thermal basins is to test probe the surface ahead of movement using the extendable sampling rods that are part of the standard field kit. Each cohort member carries one. You probe ahead, identify stable ground, move forward. It's slow. It works. It adds roughly an hour to the transit time for a basin of this size, which the exam timeline accounts for. Elliot stopped at the basin edge and looked at the surface for a long time. I mean a long time, 40 seconds of just looking while the rest of the cohort stood behind him. His biometric readings, heart rate 61, oxygenation 94%, slightly down from the elevated sulfur content. Core temp within normal range. Then he crouched down and picked up a small piece of loose rock from the highland surface. He tossed it lightly onto the basin floor about 2 meters out. It clicked against the surface, didn't crack through. He tossed another slightly farther, click stable. He picked up a handful of small pebbles and began dropping them in a slow, expanding fan pattern across the visible surface ahead, watching each one, noting the sound, a clear click for solid ground, a slightly duller sound for thinner crust, listening for anything that shifted underneath. "What is he doing?" Cadet Purr asked from behind him. "Testing the crust resonance," Elliot said without turning around. "Denser substrate sounds different. You want the ones that ring clear." "You know this because," Purr started. "Frozen lake ice," Elliot said. "Same principle, My grandfather used to take me ice fishing. You learn not to stand in the wrong places." There was a silence. "Your planet has frozen lakes," Gretmaka said. "Our planet has everything," Elliot said, and something in the way he said it, flat, unperformed, just a statement of fact, made the hair on my arm stand up, and I was sitting in a pressurized observation bay 600 kilometers above him. He spent 12 minutes mapping a route across the thermal basin, using nothing but thrown pebbles and his own hearing. He marked it as he went, tying a piece of field cord from his kit to small rock cairns he built at each turn point, creating a visible trail through the maze of stable ground. The cohort crossed the thermal basin in 22 minutes. Not one person broke through. Standard protocol crossing time for a basin of that configuration, 67 minutes. In the observation bay, the supervising instructor, a senior Keth named Examiner Thorven, had been silent for most of the morning. When the cohort cleared the far edge of the thermal basin and the timer was noted, Thorven made a notation on his assessment panel and said nothing. But I was sitting 3 seats to his left, and I saw his secondary lids flicker once. That was, for a Keth, roughly equivalent to someone else dropping their jaw. Chapter 6. What happened at The Ridge? The route from the far edge of the thermal basin to the extraction point ran through a narrow ridgeline passage, a natural corridor between 2 elevated formations, about 15 meters wide and roughly 80 meters long, with walls of loose shale on either side. The shale was the issue. Kareth 7 tectonic activity manifests not just in the thermal basin, but in regular small-scale seismic events, essentially microtremors, usually minor, but in areas with loose shale slopes, a microtremor is enough to trigger a cascade fall. The ridgeline passage was flagged in the exam environment briefing as elevated loose material hazard. The recommendation was to move through quickly and in single file to minimize ground vibration. The cohort entered the passage at single file formation, standard protocol. Elliot was third in the file between Gretmaka and Thessaly. They were approximately 40 meters in when the tremor hit. It was minor by Kareth 7 standards, a 0.2 on the seismic scale, which the Academy's environmental sensors registered as essentially routine. But minor on Kareth 7 is not minor by most inhabited world standards, and the shale on the left wall of the passage responded to it by beginning to come down. The cascade started at the top of the left wall, maybe 12 meters up, and moved down in a widening spread, which is how shale falls work. Not all at once. A fan, opening downward, with the heaviest material accumulating at the bottom of the fan. The leading edge of the fall was aimed directly at the section of the passage where Cadet Liss was walking. Liss was at the back of the single-file formation, 3 meters behind the nearest other cohort member. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. I watched the drone feed at the time, and I've watched the recording approximately 60 times since, and I can tell you that what happened in those 4 seconds doesn't line up with any response time analysis I've seen applied to Avethian, Drovian, Keth, or Shreth physiology. Elliot turned before the first piece of shale made a sound, before the cascade was visible on the drone feed. He turned toward the sound of the tectonic event the instant it registered, and I know it was before the visible cascade because I checked the timestamps, and the turn precedes the first falling material by approximately 0.6 of a second. He was at the back of the formation in 2 seconds. The passage was 15 meters wide. Elliot had been walking third in file, roughly 8 meters from the back wall. He covered that distance in 2 seconds while the other cohort members were still processing what was happening. He hit Liss with a full-body shoulder check that took both of them out of the fall zone. And I want to be clear that this was not a stumbling, clumsy grab. It was precise, controlled. He drove with his shoulder at an angle that carried both of them laterally rather than knocking Liss down, absorbing the impact through his own legs and spine while keeping Liz upright, and he had them both against the right wall of the passage before the leading edge of the shale cascade hit the spot where Liz had been standing. The shale fell for about 3 more seconds. A significant pile of material accumulated where the back third of the file had been. Silence. Then Gretmaka said, very quietly in Shreth, something that the translation system rendered as, "What manner of creature moves like that?" I wrote it down verbatim in my observer log. I still have the log. Chapter 7. What SEVANI said. In the aftermath of the shale fall, the cohort took approximately 10 minutes to clear enough of the debris to move through the passage and emerge on the far side. Elliot helped move shale with his hands and field tools. He worked steadily and efficiently, and at no point appeared injured, despite having driven his shoulder into a wall cover maneuver with enough force to move an Ilvan bodily out of a fall zone. Later, when I was able to review the full biometric data, this happened after the exam, when the observer core collated all monitoring records. I found that Elliot's heart rate during the shalefall event peaked at 112 beats per minute. For a human, that's an elevated but not extreme exercise rate. It's the heart rate of someone going for a brisk run. For comparison, Gretmaka's heart rate peaked at 171 during the same event. Savani's hit 164. Liz's registered as 193, which is apparently in the high-stress range for Ilvan. Elliot's heart rate returned to 67 within 40 seconds of the event. 67. He ran 8 meters in 2 seconds, executed a precision physical intervention, and his heart rate was 67 40 seconds later. But the thing I want to tell you about is what Savani said when they were clear of the passage, and the cohort was taking a brief rest to check equipment and biometrics. Savani was a Keth, and Keth are not typically forthcoming with opinions in social situations. They process, they observe, and when they have something to say, it tends to be precise and considered. Savani had been, for the entire exam up to that point, quiet. More quiet than Elliot actually, which is saying something. He sat down on a flat rock on the far side of the ridge passage. He took off his filter mask briefly to recalibrate the fit. The shale dust had fouled the edge seal slightly. He looked at Elliot, who was standing a few meters away checking the structural integrity of his field kit after the impact. And Savani said, in the deliberate, careful way Keth speak in second or third languages, "There is a phrase we have on Darkalo 3. The translation is imprecise, but it means roughly, the stillest water hides the fastest current." Elliot looked at him. "I mean," Savani said, "that I think you have been very still." A moment passed between them. Then Elliot nodded once, the way a person nods when they've been seen and they're deciding how to receive it. "Old habit," Elliot said. Savani put his filter mask back on and didn't say anything else. I wrote the whole exchange down in my observer log. At the time I wrote it, I didn't fully understand why it seemed so important. I understand now. Savani, who was a careful person who chose his words precisely, had identified in 40 minutes of field observation something that the entire academy system had failed to identify in 2 years of classroom assessment. That Elliot Marsh was not a quiet person because he had nothing to contribute. He was quiet because he was running much deeper than anyone had thought to look. Chapter 8. The Storm. They were 4 hours and 50 minutes into the 6-hour exam when the ionic storm arrived. The exam environment briefing had noted that ionic storms were possible during the scheduled window. Kareth 7 has a magnetospheric irregularity that produces them periodically, and the exam cycle administrators had noted a moderate probability of storm activity. Moderate probability on Kareth 7 means roughly what moderate probability on Earth means. It happens often enough that you plan for it, but not so often that you reschedule. This one was faster and wider than the pre-exam modeling had suggested. Ionic storms on Kareth 7 produce a combination of effects that I can describe, but honestly have a hard time fully conveying from the observation bay perspective. There's the visible component, a massive discharge of electrical energy across the cloud layer that turns the yellow-orange sky into something closer to white-violet, constantly flickering. There's the physical component, significant wind acceleration, particle bombardment from charged material in the atmosphere, and the electromagnetic interference that degrades electronics in a radius proportional to storm intensity. And there's the biological component, which is the one most relevant here. Ionic particle bombardment isn't immediately lethal in standard protective gear, but it causes significant sensory disruption in most carbon-based species. Vision bleaches, hearing distorts, proprioception, your sense of where your body is in space, becomes unreliable. It's deeply disorienting. The storm hit the cohort's position with about 40 seconds of visible warning, enough time to see the front edge rolling toward them, but not enough time to reach any meaningful shelter. The terrain around them was open scrubland, 400 meters from a rock formation that might have provided partial cover. Elliot saw the storm front at the same moment as everyone else. He made one assessment immediately. "We don't run," he said, "we anchor." The rock formation, Thessaly started. "We can't reach it. We go down, pack tight, and we ride it." "The particle bombardment," Gretmaka said, "is survivable if we minimize exposure profile," Elliot said. "Down means less surface area. Pack means we cover each other's gaps. It's going to be loud and disorienting, but it will pass. These systems are fast-moving." He said it without looking at the storm. He was looking at the ground, finding a slight depression in the terrain, a natural low point, not dramatic, maybe 30 centimeters lower than the surrounding surface, but enough to provide marginal shielding from the wind-driven particles. "Here," he said, pointing, "everyone in, lowest possible profile. Face down, cover your visors." They went down. It says something about what the preceding hours had done to the cohort's assessment of Elliot that nobody questioned it. Not really. There was a moment, I saw it on the drone feed, where Gretmaka hesitated, where the Shreth stubbornness flared briefly, and then subsided, and Gretmaka went down into the depression with everyone else. The storm hit. The drone feeds went partially static from the electromagnetic interference. I lost biometrics on 3 of the cohort members for 7 minutes, Liss, Sevani, and Purr. The remaining feeds showed fragmented data. I could see on the feed from the aerial drone, which had moved to a higher altitude to try to stay above the storm layer, the position of the cohort as a single dense cluster in the terrain depression. Nobody moved. For the record, ionic storm events on Kareth 7 last an average of 11 to 22 minutes. This one lasted 14. When it passed, the sky was still the bruised yellow-orange but darker, and the ground around the cohort's position was scorched in long strips from particle bombardment. The depression they'd been in had collected some loose material from the wind, but nothing significant. Biometrics came back online as the electromagnetic interference cleared. Elliot, heart rate 69. I checked it twice, 69. The Shreth cadet showed 148. Liss was at 176. Thessaly was at 151. Sevani was at 144. Elliot's heart rate was 69. And then, as the static cleared on the ground-level drone feed and I could see the cohort beginning to rise from the depression, I watched Elliot sit up, look at the sky, just look at it, for a few seconds the way you look at something after it's done being frightening, and then look at the people around him, one by one, a quick visual check, making sure everyone was there, making sure everyone was functional. Not a dramatic sweep, not performed, just a person making sure the people near them were okay. He said, "Good, everyone's good. Extraction point is about 900 meters northwest. Let's finish this." And they got up and they walked and they finished. They reached the extraction point at 16:21 hours, 17 minutes ahead of schedule despite the storm delay, which meant the storm delay didn't cost them time, because they had made everything before it fast enough to absorb it. The extraction shuttle met them at the designated coordinates. Standard procedure. I watched the drone feed as the cohort boarded. Liss was moving a little unsteadily. Ilvan's sensory processing takes longer to recalibrate after ionic disruption. Savani was quieter than usual, which for a Keth is essentially silence. Gretmaka was doing the Shreth thing where they perform physical inventory of themselves, checking each limb, each joint, systematically, the way Shreth do after high-stress events to confirm structural integrity. Elliot walked onto the shuttle last. He turned at the top of the ramp and looked back at Kareth 7 for a moment, the dark rock, the yellow-orange sky, the scrubland still smoking faintly in the distance from the storm's particle burn. The drone caught his face in three-quarter profile. He looked thoughtful, not triumphant, not relieved, just thoughtful, the way someone looks when they're noting something down internally. Then he turned and went inside. The post-exam debrief took place the following morning, standard procedure. Cohorts and observer cadets gathered in the main review chamber, and the supervising examiners walked through the assessment period, event by event, noting decisions made and evaluating them against protocol and performance standards. Examiner Thorvin ran the debrief. He was precise about it, walked through every event in chronological order, displayed the drone footage, reviewed biometric records. Professional and methodical, the way Keth examiners always are. He got to the spined crawler identification event, displayed the drone footage, timed the identification. Noted that Elliot had identified the biological presence at 200 meters, using what the examiner called, in careful academy language, informal environmental sensing methods. He noted that the identification was accurate, and the resulting navigation decision was correct. He got to the thermal basin crossing, displayed Elliot's surface mapping method, noted the time improvement over standard protocol, noted that the method relied on non-standard tactile and acoustic assessment. He got to the shale fall, displayed the footage, ran it at standard speed, then ran it again at half speed. Then said, without any inflection, that the response time from tectonic event detection to physical intervention completion was 1.9 seconds, and that this fell significantly outside the documented response time ranges for general sciences cadet field assessments across all enrolled species. He paused. Then he said, "The assessment for this intervention will be reviewed by the Academy's Physical Performance Standards Committee before final scoring is applied." In the review chamber, I heard Cadet Thren make that sound again, the low non-word sound, the O sound. Elliot, sitting in the cohort row, said nothing. His expression was, and I watched him carefully, because by that point I was watching him carefully all the time, neutral, not nervous, not defensive, just present and patient and waiting. Thorvin continued the debrief, got to the storm event, reviewed the decision to shelter in place rather than attempt to reach the rock formation, did the math on movement time versus storm arrival time, confirmed, formally, what had been obvious to me when watching. They could not have reached the rock formation before the storm hit, and the shelter-in-place decision had been correct. He noted, without comment, that the decision had been made and communicated by Elliot Marsh within 15 seconds of storm front visibility. He closed the debrief by saying that final scores would be posted within 3 Academy days, pending the physical performance review. Afterwards, in the hallway outside the review chamber, Gretmaka found Elliot and said something to him. I was close enough to hear it. The Shreth cadet said, "I want you to know that I would not have moved as fast as you did. I would have tried and I would not have made it, and Liss would have been seriously injured or killed. So, thank you." It was a long speech for a Shreth. Shreth don't typically verbalize gratitude in such direct terms. They tend to express obligation through action rather than words. The fact that Gretmaka used words meant it was important. Elliot said, you just would have done it differently. Gretmaka considered this. Then, perhaps, but you were faster. I've had a lot of practice, Elliot said. Practice? Gretmaka repeated, as if the word didn't quite fit what they were trying to describe. I grew up somewhere with a lot of things to react to, Elliot said. It's not like Verath Station or Aviath Sul. It's not a controlled environment. You're always either noticing things or you're not noticing things, and not noticing things has consequences. Your planet made you like this, Gretmaka said. Elliot almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of a person who has spent a long time waiting for someone to say the obvious thing. It made all of us like this, he said. We just usually don't have a reason to show it. The Physical Performance Standards Committee released its findings 8 days after the exam. I got a copy from Thren, who was connected to the Observer Corps senior cadets, who had access to the interdepartment document circulation. The report was 23 pages long and deeply technical. I'm going to try to summarize what was relevant without getting lost in the measurement methodology. The committee had reviewed not just the response time data from Elliot's shalefall intervention, but had requested, and received, permission to conduct a supplementary physical assessment of Elliot himself. This was not standard procedure. Supplementary assessments are usually reserved for contested cases or anomalous injury documentation. But the committee chair, a senior Avethian researcher named Assessor Dren, had apparently read the drone footage report and felt that more information was needed before any evaluation could be issued. Elliot had agreed to the assessment. He'd agreed readily, the committee report noted, without asking many questions about what it involved or why it had been requested. He'd shown up at the assessment chamber at the scheduled time and done what was asked of him. The report's findings. On reaction time, Elliot's reaction time to sudden auditory and visual stimuli placed him in the 97th percentile of all assessed species in the Academy's testing history. This was not the 97th percentile of humans. It was the 97th percentile of every organism that had ever sat in that assessment chair. The committee noted that the closest comparable performance on record was a Shreth military veteran who had been enrolled in the Academy's Advanced Defense Studies track. On pain tolerance and stress response, the committee had included, as part of the assessment, a calibrated physical stress protocol, controlled temperature variation, mild pressure stress, and sustained high-intensity sensory load. The assessment was designed to measure how a subject's cognitive performance degraded under physical stress. In most species, there was a notable degradation curve. In Elliot, cognitive performance under the tested stress conditions degraded by approximately 4%. 4. The committee noted, with what felt like academic understatement, that this was atypically low and that they had rerun the assessment twice to confirm the result. On environmental sensing, the committee had replicated, in controlled conditions, a version of the spined crawler scenario, a hidden biological presence at distance, with no visual indicator and minimal auditory signature. Elliot had identified the test presence at 180 meters by scent and air movement analysis, with an accuracy of 3 degrees on bearing. The assessors noted that this was comparable to performance levels documented for certain specialist Shreth hunting subspecies, but was not previously documented in human physiological literature. There was a section near the end of the report, I read it 3 times, where Assessor Dren wrote a personal observation, not standard committee format, a personal note in the margins of the academic language. It said, "It should be noted that the subject appeared to be moderating his performance throughout the supplementary assessment. This conclusion is not based on biometric evidence, which showed no signs of deliberate restraint. It is based on the assessor's subjective experience of observing the assessment. The subject performed at consistently high levels, but appeared to do so without reaching any apparent ceiling. This assessor has conducted physical performance assessments for 11 years and is accustomed to identifying the point at which a subject is working at full capacity. That point was not clearly identified in this assessment. I read that section, and I sat with it for a long time. She was saying that she couldn't find his ceiling. She looked for it professionally and carefully, and she couldn't find it. 3 weeks after the exam, I found Elliot in the Academy's general library, which is an enormous vaulted space in the center of the station, lit with the kind of full-spectrum lighting designed to be comfortable for as many species as possible, which results in a light quality that nobody finds quite right but everyone finds tolerable. It was late in the study period. The library was mostly empty. He was in a corner alcove at a small table, writing by hand on actual physical paper. His field notes from the exam, I found out later. He was transcribing them into a more organized format. I sat down across from him. We were in the same general sciences cohort. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times in 2 years, mostly practical exchanges about shared coursework. But after the exam, and after the committee report, I had been composing questions for weeks and hadn't asked any of them because I hadn't found the right moment, and also, I'll admit this, because I was a little intimidated in a way I hadn't expected to be. He looked up when I sat down. "Observer Corps debrief," he said. He'd apparently known I was one of the observer cadets for his exam. I hadn't known he knew. "No," I said. I wanted to ask you some things, not for a report." He set his pen down. He was patient about it, waited. "Were you always like that?" I said. "Or did something happen? Did you train? Did the academy?" "No," he said, "not the academy." "Then, Earth," he said simply. I waited. He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable. Just thinking about where to start. He picked up his pen and turned it over in his fingers, a human habit I'd noticed, this constant low-level hand movement, this fidgeting with objects. It's tactile processing, I've since read, keeps the manual nervous system engaged while the verbal centers are working. "Where I grew up," he said, it wasn't an easy place, geographically, and my family did a lot of outdoor work. My grandfather was a fisherman. My father worked search and rescue in a mountain range. My mother was a field biologist who spent about a third of every year in environments that would have been flagged Deathworld by your taxonomy, though she just called it field work. He paused. I spent a lot of time outside, in places where the wrong step meant something. Where you learned to read the environment, or you made expensive mistakes. But the reaction time, I started. "It's not exceptional," he said. "Not by Earth standards. I mean, I'm on the higher end for humans maybe. But anyone who's grown up doing fast decision outdoor activities has some version of it. Rock climbers, emergency responders, military, people who work with large animals, it's common. We don't perform it here at the academy. There's no reason to. It's a school. You pay attention in class and you do your coursework and you don't need to be fast." "You were hiding it," I said. He thought about this. Not hiding, just not displaying. There's a difference. I wasn't pretending not to be able to do it. I just wasn't in a situation that asked for it. "That's what Savani said," I told him. "The stillest water hiding the fastest current." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a better way to put it than I manage." "Are all humans like this?" I asked. And I heard myself ask it, and I heard how it sounded wide-eyed, naive, and I felt briefly embarrassed. But he didn't treat it as a naive question. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at me. "Yes and no," he said. "We're all capable. The biology is the same. We evolved in the same place under the same pressures. But most of us who come to the academy, we come here because we want to learn, not because we want to prove anything. We're young. We're excited about the galaxy. We want to get along." So we adapt to the social environment the way our species always adapts to environments. We read the room and we match it. He paused. The room said, smart, careful, collegial, so that's what we were. And Kareth 7. The room said something different, he said. I sat with that. Does it scare people, I asked, when they find out about humans, about what you are? He looked at me steadily. Does it scare you? I thought about it honestly. I thought about the spined crawler, the thermal basin, the shale fall, the storm, the report from Assessor Dren. I thought about sitting in the observation bay watching his heart rate hold at 69 through an ionic storm. No, I said, and I meant it. It makes me feel safer, actually, which is strange to say. But it does. He nodded, once the way he'd nodded at Sevani. That's what it's supposed to do, he said. We're not weapons. We're not a threat. Earth is rough and we're made by it, but we're made for the same thing every social species is made for, keeping the group intact. That's the whole point. Individually, we're not that impressive by the numbers, but we evolved in a world where the group was the only thing that worked. So we're very, very good at keeping it intact. He picked up his pen again, looked down at his notes. Liss was in the wrong place, he said. The shale was coming down, I got there. That's just what you do. I want to tell you what happened after, because this isn't just a story about one exam on one Deathworld in one afternoon. It's about what the Academy did with what it learned, and what happened when the information started to move. The Physical Performance Standards Committee report was technically classified, internal department use only, not for general student circulation. But the Academy is 14,000 people living in close proximity, and classified information in a school environment moves the way water moves through soil. Within 2 weeks, every senior cadet in the general sciences track knew the broad strokes of the findings. Within a month, faculty across departments were asking careful questions about whether the existing assessment protocols for human cadets needed revision. Assessor Dren submitted a formal research proposal to the Academy's Xenobiology faculty. The title of the proposal was Environmental Conditioning and Physiological Adaptation in Homo sapiens, a re-examination of Deathworld taxonomy as applied to species of origin. It was approved within 30 days, which in Academy administrative terms is essentially instantaneous. The study enrolled 14 human cadets who consented to participate, including Elliot. It ran for a full academic year. I'm not going to summarize all of it because the full paper is available in the Academy's Open Access Research Archive, and it's long and technical, and if you're interested you should read it yourself. But I'll tell you the headline. The headline was, Humans Are Not Average. They are not adequately described by the young spacefaring civilization category that the Assembly's diplomatic taxonomy applies to them. They are a Deathworld species that has been performing baseline social calibration since first contact, and the performance has been so thorough and so consistent that the broader galactic community took it for the truth. The paper put it this way. The human specimens assessed in this study display physiological and cognitive characteristics consistent with evolutionary origin in a Class 4 environmental hostility environment. These characteristics include, but are not limited to, exceptional stress response regulation, heightened multimodal environmental sensing, rapid tactical assessment under degraded input conditions, anomalously high pain tolerance, and social cohesion instincts of unusual strength. The fact that these characteristics have not been previously documented in the academic literature on human physiology reflects not an absence of these characteristics, but an absence of conditions that elicited their expression. An absence of conditions that elicited their expression. I read that line and I thought about Elliot sitting in the third row of unified physics, writing on paper, answering when called on, not pushing, not hiding, just not displaying. waiting for a room that asked for something different. The paper was, in academic terms, quite significant. It was cited immediately and extensively. It opened research threads that I know, even now, are still being pursued in xenobiology departments across the assembly. It caused a quiet but significant administrative review of how human cadets were assessed, supported, and integrated at the academy. And it caused, more informally, a shift in the way human cadets were looked at by their fellow students. Not fear, not awe exactly, something closer to recognition. The kind you feel when you've been looking at something familiar in a wrong light for a long time and someone finally angles the lamp correctly and you see the actual shape. I want to tell you one more thing about Elliot, and it's the thing I think about most when I think about that year and what I learned from it. Near the end of the academic year, 7 months after the exam, there was a social event in the communal bay. One of the cultural exchange evenings the Academy organizes periodically where species share traditional food items, music, stories. They're well-intentioned and slightly awkward in the way that events designed to be cross-cultural always are, but they're also genuinely warm in their way. Elliot had brought something to share, which was unusual. He'd never participated in the cultural exchange evenings in the 2 years before, as far as I knew. What he brought was a thermos of something, and a small container of a dark substance, and he set them up at a table and made himself available. The something in the thermos was coffee. The dark substance was what humans call chocolate. He explained them both briefly and without ceremony. The coffee was a drink made from roasted beans, mild stimulant, important cultural significance on Earth. The chocolate was made from a tropical plant, sweet, long-standing ritual significance across multiple human cultures, used historically for everything from religious ceremony to medical treatment to comfort during periods of stress. He handed both to anyone who asked, and he watched their reactions, the variable response to the bitterness of the coffee, the almost universal positive response to the chocolate, with an expression that was warm and quiet and genuinely pleased. Not performing pleasure, actually experiencing it. Thessaly tried the chocolate and said, "This is remarkable," in a voice that was slightly stunned. Elliot said, "We've been making it for about 4,000 years. 4,000. We've had a long time to work on it." Thren tried the coffee and made a face, and said it tasted like something organic was burning. Elliot said, "Most people think so the first time. We're weirdly devoted to it anyway." Lys's luminescence did something that translated as delight when they tried the chocolate. The Ilven communicates a lot through bioluminescence, and delight looks like a soft pulse of warm yellow-white. Elliot watched it, and his expression did something I hadn't seen on him before, something fully open, fully present. He looked genuinely delighted by the delight. I watched him for a long time that evening. He moved around the space, talked to people, asked questions, listened more than he spoke, not performing, not calibrating, just being. The same quiet that he'd always had, but different somehow, not contained, just natural. I think about that evening when I think about what he said in the library. We evolved for keeping the group intact. He meant it as a description of the physiology of the crisis response, of the shale fall and the storm. But watching him at that cultural exchange evening, I thought, he means this too. This is also it. The thing that makes humans what they are isn't just the reaction time and the pain tolerance and the survival instincts. It's the thermos of coffee and the container of chocolate and the attention, the genuine full presence attention they pay to other people's experiences. They're built to survive, yes, but they're also built deeply, fundamentally, encoded in everything they do to care about the outcome, to want the people around them to be all right, to feel something real when the Ilven cadet's bioluminescence pulses warm yellow-white over a piece of chocolate. Both things are true at the same time. The storm-still heart rate and the warm, open expression. The precision of the intervention and the patience of the library conversation. The Deathworld body and the 4,000-year-old comfort food. You can't separate them. That's the point. They're the same thing coming from the same place, a species that survived by being both fast enough to act and connected enough to care.